Okay, hello everyone and welcome to today's session on 10 contract for your next Agile project. Friends, my name is Sunan Sharma. I am an Agile consultant based in Den Haag, Netherlands and moderator for this webinar. So before I introduce today's guest, few do's and don'ts for this session. So if you have any questions for our speaker, please post in chat. We pick questions in last if time permits. Please do not unmute yourself during the session. Please keep your webcam on all the time so that it will be keep you focused and away from all the distraction. And a recorded version of this session will be available on our YouTube channel Careerstalk, so you can go back and see it again. Okay, so friends, I would like to introduce today's speaker as Mr. Alignment. He's a co-founder of few companies, speaker, executive agile coach, certified scrum trainer. He helped many organizations with their agile transformation. He's the author of several books, and he's none other than Peter Stephens. So welcome, Peter, and many thanks for accepting our invitation. And it's an honor for all of us to have you in this session. Thanks, Peter. Over to you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak here and for the rousing introduction. I always say, is he really talking about me? But yeah, I guess so. Anyway, and I'm also really excited to see everyone here.
Yep.
So I'm going to try to get a little bit creative with my screen share. I'm going to try doing it a different way, which is always a little bit, how shall I say? You never quite know how it's going to work until it does. So with any luck, you all should be able to see the planets now. Okay, and this is kind of a hint about one of my favorite hobbies, which is space flight and space travel. And I was a great Star Trek fan when I was growing up. So anyway, I'd like to talk to you about projects and project risk. And the message is really simple. You can manage the risks of product development. Okay, that's what Agile frameworks are for. Okay, contracts are also intended to manage risk, but the problem we have with contracts, classical contracts, is they're not really aligned with how Agile projects manage the risk. And there are far, far better ways of doing it, which are more in your interest, even if you're on the customer side or the client side, that are more in your interest than a classical fixed price, fixed scope. So today I'd like to talk to you about how to get better results from an Agile team. Okay, now you heard me called Mr. Alignment. This is kind of a side effect of my work in personal agility. Personal agility is about aligning what you do with what really matters. And it turns out that that is a powerful organizing, it's a scalable organizing concept. I've seen evidence of it in projects that have entailed 400,000 people. So you can't even really call them projects anymore. They're more like mobilizations. My Agile career started here at this factory called SIG in Neuhausen, which is just above one of Europe's largest waterfalls, the Rhinefall. And I always found it ironic that I first applied Agile methods while my office nearly had a view of the waterfall. As you pointed out, I've started a number of things. Some of them are better known than others. Perhaps you've heard of the World Agility Forum, an annual celebration of good applications of agility. I'm the creator of the Personal Agility System, which we've already talked about, and we have a book on the same topic. And I've also written, well, first a blog article and more recently a book on the subject of Agile contracts, okay, which is basically getting beyond fixed price, fixed scope, how to get the most out of your Agile team. And I like to think that what I do is first and foremost bringing hope to environments that well, maybe they've kind of found hope and common sense to be somewhat rare flowers. So we've talked about how to ask questions, okay? Now, right now, I can't see the chat. So, what I'll do is I'll give the talk, and then when I get to the end of the talk, we'll come back and circle around what's in the chat. But, if something comes up, please ask me the question, and I'll do my best to answer all of them, and maybe we can take them offline into an offline chat afterwards if we don't get everything done before we run out of time. So why do we do agility? Well, you may have heard of Jeff Sutherland's book, Twice the Work in Half the Time, and he got it half right, okay? It's really about achieving all the goals. And if you do it well, you'll get there, you'll need to do about half the work, and it'll take you about a quarter of the time of what it would have taken you classically. And Walter Stulzer, this was actually a client of mine. His company was faced with existential challenges. He had 2 years to fix the problem. He tried to do it classically. He got nowhere. He then took the same problem with an agile approach and had his problem solved in 6 months. Half the things they thought they had to do, they didn't need to do. So really, all of the goals, half the work, a quarter of the time. Now, what is it that makes projects difficult? Okay, well, every time you kick off a project, every project is a leap of faith. Okay, and just like this young lady jumping over a cliff, a project can land badly. It can hurt if you fall. Okay, and the thing is, maybe you've heard about Murphy, everything that can go wrong will go wrong. Well, it's actually more dramatic than that. Everything that can happen will happen, most especially including the things going wrong. Okay, so what do we have to do? Well, what is risk management about? It's about making sure that those bad things don't happen. Okay, now when we write a contract, what we do is we define the rules of the game. Okay, now the rules of the game tell the players what's expected of them, and they're going to do their best to satisfy the rules of the game. And if the rules of the game encourage you to work forever without producing anything, well, that's exactly what they're going to do. On the other hand, if you have rules of the game that encourage people to produce stuff that works on time and on budget, they'll do that too. Now, I'd like to give you an example of this. You're probably familiar with the challenge of time and materials projects. From the point of view of the supplier, this is the way to go because you've got no risk. You just keep working and the customer keeps paying you. And your profit margins, to be honest, they suck. That's the big problem with the, pardon my French, but that's the big problem with the service business is that compared to product development, the product margins aren't very good, but they are dependable. Okay, you work a certain amount, you charge a certain amount. As long as you keep your costs under control, you're good. But from the point of view of the client, it's a different story. Because if you're just working on time and materials, well, are we ever going to finish? Okay, and here in Switzerland, we have an expression, except for the expenses, nothing was produced. Okay, and that's the risk with the time and materials project. Now, let's talk about some big time and materials projects. For instance, NASA Project Orion. Now, if you're familiar with the history of this, back in the 60s, the United States, they did the Apollo program. Then they needed a successor to the Apollo program, which was the space shuttle. The space shuttle was a good idea on paper, but well, there were issues with that as well. And it was much more expensive than they thought it would be. And over time, they discovered it was also much more dangerous than they thought it was. And by the early 2000s, it was clear they needed to replace the space shuttle with something new. And so what we're looking here is the capsule that would take the astronauts into space for a thing called Project Orion. And this was supposed to be the new Apollo capsule, and it was going to sit on the Space Launch System, which was basically a re-envisioned Saturn V using space shuttle boosters. Wonderful. The problem is politicians don't like explosions, and politicians are funding the project. What politicians like are reliable jobs, okay, in as many districts as possible. And, this was a great political project because there was funding and, there were people working in all the districts. So really no one could vote against it. 15 years, 18, 19, depending on how you count it, $20 billion later, they had accumulated a total test flight time of 4 hours and 36 minutes. Had they gone to orbit? No. Were they close to carrying an astronaut to orbit? Well, let's put it this way. Some people will say more or less, but that stat was 2 years ago, and they're still 2 years away from orbit. So we'll see. Having said that, NASA realized already back in the mid 2000s that they had a problem. And so they decided to experiment with some alternative approaches and alternative suppliers. And they'd given a mandate to SpaceX, which I'll come back to in a minute, to provide services to NASA going into space. And so now I think this is 2010. Garrett Reisman is scheduled to be one of the astronauts on the Space Shuttle Atlantis. There is a delay in takeoff as they're going through some last-minute checks, and the astronauts had some time to kill. So they'd heard about SpaceX, and they decided to go look at what they were doing. And now there's this little toy rocket company. I wonder if they're doing anything serious. And what they saw just blew them away. They were amazed. They were stunned. These guys could do it a week what would take NASA years. These guys could do for a few $1,000s what would take NASA millions of dollars. And they were just shocked. Okay. In fact, it even became a mantra as they were, moving forward later, trying to do problem solving. They would ask themselves the question, what would SpaceX do? Okay. Now, SpaceX was part of a thing called the Commercial Cargo Program. And the idea with the Commercial Cargo Program was they weren't contracting for the rocket. What they did is they said, we want someone who will launch cargo to the International Space Station. And they would, pay certain amounts of money if certain test criteria were met, but basically those amounts were fixed and defined in advance. And if you didn't meet the milestones, you didn't get your money. And in fact, NASA ended up contracting with three providers, probably the best known as SpaceX, Orbital Science. This was actually the plan B after their original second supplier was not able to deliver. And so they canceled that contract and they gave the contract to a third company. I believe they belong to Northrop Grumman. And now the two of them are able to provide reliable service to the transport service to the International Space Station for cargo. Now, this gave them the proof that the concept worked. And it also gave them the confidence to try it on something much riskier, which was taking actual astronauts to the International Space Station. After the shuttle was retired, the only alternative was to fly in a Russian Soyuz aircraft, which for some strange reason was getting more and more expensive as time went on. So what NASA did is they said they're going to put out, once again, they're going to work with two suppliers, competitive bidding to figure out which one gets it. They ended up picking Boeing and SpaceX. From NASA's perspective, this was a complete success because they now had two spaceships. One of them, at the time I created this slide about a year ago, was already in service. I believe Crew Dragon has now taken astronauts. I think they've done it 3 times and they're about to launch the 4th mission. Boeing Starliner had some issues with, we'll call that integration risk or technical risk, getting the pieces to work in the actual test flight. So they had a bit of a setback. But their test flight is now scheduled. From NASA's point of view, they're good because they have one, and when they have another, they'll have the redundancy, so that if they have an issue along the way with one of them, they'll be able to continue flying the other one. Okay, so let's come back to perhaps more down-to-earth problems and projects. What is the challenge of complex projects? Maybe what's special about complexity? Well, let's look at classical construction projects, physical things, okay, like a runway. And the thing about a runway is before we ask for that runway to be built, we can know pretty much everything about the runway. We know the size of the aircraft that are going to land there. We know the wind conditions. Depending on the jurisdiction, the noise restrictions may or may not be a topic here in Zurich. It's a huge topic, so they'll spend, 10, 15 years figuring out which runway to build and which direction to point it in and how long it can be. But once they've decided to do it, all of the decisions have been taken. And you can issue a parts list for the runway lights, 2 years before you build the runway, because that's uniquely specified. Now that worked just great for buildings and tunnels and things like that. And these projects are complex and they're still challenging, but we can do it. They don't fail miserably usually, or at least not very often. Whereas when the 90s came around and this thing called the internet happened and we started having workstations and PCs, and this all accelerated even more as we got, smartphones and tablets and stuff like that. We had IT projects and software projects and organizational transformations. And all of a sudden the complexity just exploded and our classical approaches of managing software started to fail, and not just fail a little bit, but they really failed miserably. Okay, so here was the challenge. We had a new problem which required new management. Okay, and that new management is based on is now what we call agile software development. And the key difference is for things that we build classically, you can know what you need in advance. Whereas for things like software and products where there's a high degree of uncertainty, you literally cannot know in advance what you need, because it's not until you've shown it to the customer or tested it in the environment that you can actually see whether it works or not. Okay, and so this is where we see that leading complex projects is simply different. Okay, it's a different challenge. And this brings us with a new challenge. How do we bring quality, speed, and complexity all under the same roof? So what I'd like to do, kind of with the rest of this presentation, is I'd like to take a look at the question, what does it mean to be agile? What is this agile stuff really about? Is it about story points, or is it about something more profound? I'd like to take a deep look at the risks of a development project, a complex development project, and then using Scrum as an example, take a look at how agile frameworks manage these risks. Okay, now, one thing, I don't really know who is in the room. I hope everybody here is a grown-up, because I've toned down the adult language. Some people get upset about that, but the inconvenient truths, sorry, there's nothing I can do about it, guys. Managerial discretion is advised. Okay, you've been warned. Is everyone still with me? If you need to do the law of 2 feet thing, now is a good time to do it. But one thing which I would like to do is, if there are people here saying, but the way I've been doing projects is just fine for what I do, that's perfectly okay. You may still find yourself doing some projects classically. Okay, if you can have a high degree of clarity about what you're doing before you start doing it, then the classical approach is probably okay. It's where the complexity dominates that you need to be agile. Okay, and by the end of this presentation, you'll understand why. So
Peter,
let's
hi,
get
sorry,
into it.
on this side.
Are we having an issue here?
Peter, hi, on this side. I have a small query. Can I ask?
I'm going to leave that to Sunand because I don't know what the timing is. So I think we said we'd like to have questions in the chat. Okay, so why don't you put your question in the chat, and then we'll come back to it. But we'll do the chat from top to bottom. So if you've asked the first question, you'll also get the first answer. How does that sound? Okay,
Great.
so
please go ahead.
Okay, so let's take a look at what it means to be agile. Most of you have probably heard of the Agile Manifesto. Unfortunately, I can't see the display, so I couldn't even ask for a show of hands, but maybe put a message in the chat. Have you read the Agile Manifesto before? Okay, now most presentations, when they talk about the manifesto, they talk about these 4 value pairs, so like individuals and interactions over processes and tools. But in my humble opinion, this is not what agility is about. Okay, let's zoom in on the first 2 sentences. Okay, we are uncovering better ways of developing software by doing it and helping others to do it. Our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through early and continuous delivery of valuable software. Okay, so what do these mean? Well, let's ignore the software part for a second and focus on the main, the main verbs and the subjects. We are uncovering better ways. Okay, this is about learning. Okay, we're doing it and we're helping others to do it. This is about collaboration. Okay, and finally, our highest priority is to satisfy the customer. So this is about purpose. Okay, so for me, agility at its heart is about learning, it's about collaboration, it's about purpose. Okay, so if we say this is agile, what does it mean to apply that to a project? Well, let's first look at the risks of a project. What are the things that could kill your project? And then see how agility or how the agile frameworks react to them. Okay, so what are the things that can kill your project? Well, let's start with delivery risk. We get to the end of the project and there's nothing there. Now, if you talk to your clients or to your top management and say, what's the biggest risk of this project? They're going to say the biggest risk is I'm not going to get anything at all. Okay, and from their point of view, that's right, because they don't really know what's going on inside the project, but they do know that they plan to do something with the results. And if they don't have the results, then they can't do it. Okay, so for them, this is a real risk. Time and budget risk. This is kind of how we measure how we're failing. Are we late? Are we over budget? These are going to be the symptoms of not having your other risks under control. Okay, scope risk. Do we get everything we asked for? Now, if we look at this in the context of the runway problem, if you deliver me a runway and it doesn't have the runway lights, airplanes can't land there. okay? Because they're a requirement, okay? So if I ask for something and I don't get it, that's a big problem. The problem is with these complex problems, we don't know in advance what we're asking for. So we actually have a slightly different problem, which is market risk. If we build it, will the customer use it? Will they buy it? Will they want to use it? Okay, if you don't get any uptake on your product, then you've got a problem, because if no one cares about it, why should anybody buy it? And if you're dependent on external funding for it, like a startup, well, if no one cares about it, why should they fund it? Okay, and by the way, you don't know the answer to this one until you showed it to the customer. And the chances are good your first attempt is going to get it wrong. So you may actually have to iterate on it until you get it right. Now, technical risk. Okay, if you're going to build rockets, you have to have a high tolerance for explosions. Well, I guess you don't have to, but then you're probably not going to go to orbit. Okay, so things can actually go wrong when you're building it. And actually, much of the agile movement up till now has been focused on reducing technical risk. And I actually think we're moving away. When you talk to people about what makes projects fail, this is no longer usually very high on their list of problems, for the simple reason that, in the 20 years that we've had the agile movement and we've been uncovering better ways of doing it, everything from test-driven development, pair programming, DevOps, continuous integration, continuous deployment, we've actually gotten pretty good at keeping the technical risk under control if we choose to use it. Okay, social risk. This is actually very closely related to what I call the alignment problem. Can the people in the project work together more at an emotional more at an emotional level? Do they get along well enough? Can they collaborate with each other, or are they fighting with each other? If it's about your stakeholders or higher up, then I would call this an alignment problem. And this actually, when I get called in to help out with the project, this is usually why. It's about the social risks that have gotten out of control. Okay. Then we have dependencies. Now, dependencies is kind of like delivery risk within your supply chain. So if your development team doesn't have the know-how, doesn't have the skills, doesn't have the tools, doesn't have the authority to make decisions about the product or provide the particular piece of the product that's needed, they have to wait on somebody else. Okay. A big source of dependencies is approvals. Another big source of dependencies is what we call component teams, where the front end can't do anything until the middleware function is there. The middleware can't do anything until the back end is there. The back end can't do anything there until the database is there. And no one's willing to do anything at all until we have a front end design that's accurate down to the pixel. So you see how these dependencies can kind of lead us into vicious circles. Dependencies are, number 2 on my list of the things that are really evil for your project, right after bugs and multitasking. Okay, the next risk that we have is stakeholder risk. Okay, now a stakeholder is a nice word for anybody who can helicopter in and completely change the assumptions of your product. For instance, you're making a router and you say, we're going to build a product that doesn't have any network plugs. And then you come back 6 months later and say, well, actually, we want to have 4 plugs. Okay, you've just thrown out a huge amount of design work because the stakeholder has changed their mind. Frequent cause of this is a lack of clear vision, or more concretely, lack of validation about what you're supposed to be building. And you have a stakeholder in a position of authority who basically takes what the most recent client or further removed stakeholder is asking for. Okay. This leads us to change management risk, which is kind of related to this. Change management is, I said, well, I told you I wanted it in green, but actually I need it in blue. You deliver it in green and the customer says, well, I want something different. Now, if we look at change management risk, we can look at it in the context of scope risk, where we're saying, hey, wait a minute, we're getting stuff that we didn't ask for. But we can also look at it in terms of market risk, which says we actually need to be able to change our mind, because we need to do that in order to get the right thing. So there's a tension here between these different risks, and actually getting it right, being able to react to new information without totally losing control of the direction of your project is an important challenge. And finally, this is where I've toned down my language: wishful thinking. Okay, wishful thinking is not telling yourself the truth about something of importance to your project. Okay, One of my favorite examples of wishful thinking is people who say they were doing Scrum, but they have their team report to the Scrum Master report to the product owner reports to a project manager, and the actual decision-making authority is held by a client who's working on a different continent. Lots of wishful thinking going on in a project like this, okay? This was one of my favorites. Victor he's the co-founder of a company, Pragmatic Coders, based in Poland. His company is Pragmatic Coders was the winner of the World Agility Forum Award for Customer Service in 2019. Their focus is developing software for startups, okay? They want to be the software provider for, I think, a unicorn a year for the next 10 years. And he explained it very simply. All estimates are lies. But here is the problem. To get the business, the client has to pretend to know what they want, and I have to pretend to know how long it's going to take and how much money it's going to cost to deliver it. If we don't play the game, I don't get the business. So we start our relationship with a lie. This is all wishful thinking. So how do we bring this under the same roof? Well, what I want to do now is take a look at Scrum, because Scrum is a widely used example and it's well understood, and look at how Scrum manages these risks. Okay, then we get done with that, we'll circle around and say, how do we integrate this into our contract? Okay, so if we look at the classical approach to development, it's kind of modifying the assembly line or modeling the assembly line for knowledge work. Okay, so we start with some definition of what we want. We could call that the vision, we could call that the product goal. We define a series of milestones. At the end of these milestones, we should have something that we can ship, something we can use or sell. Okay, now these milestones at the beginning, they usually have to do with, various levels of stakeholders or architects or business analysts, requirements engineers saying, this is what the product is supposed to be. The ones in the middle are more about, developing stuff, and the ones at the end are about integrating and testing the stuff. And then at some point, you've got one which says deploy. And when all that is done, if all that's on time, then your product should be on time. And the problem is that didn't work very well. So I don't know if Scrum was the first framework to do this, but they started with one very simple constraint. Every 30 days, we have to have a version of the product that could be shipped and can be reviewed. Okay, so we have this, the vision that gets translated into product backlog items, which define it a bit more granularly what we're trying to achieve with this sprint. And no more than 30 days later, we want to have a shippable product. Okay. Now this has a problem with it because 30 days isn't a long time for a big project. If the project might take a year, but we can only work 30 days on it. So what happens? Well, what this means is we have to iterate on it. Okay. But we still have this constraint. Every 30 days, we have to have something we can review, something we can test. So the idea is we sit together with our stakeholders. Now, in the early days, they called these stakeholders a product owner. Today, we call them stakeholders because our product owners are a little bit closer to the team, than usual, the real decision makers in an organization. But every 30 days, we have something tangible that we can show. We can get feedback from our stakeholders. Are we building the right thing? And this enables us to get the risks under control. Now, from the point of view of the stakeholders, this is actually very powerful. Okay, and in fact, you're doing your agile transformation right when a member of the board can come and explain to you why we want to work this way. And this was one of my customers about 2 years ago after I explained it to Scrum to some of the top management, got the top management applying personal agility. One of the board members came to me and said, well, of course we want to do Scrum because every 30 days we get to evaluate what brings value. And we can do more of the stuff that does bring value and less of the stuff that doesn't. Okay, and it's this decision-making, this ability to make fairly fine-grained decisions about what to do and what not to do, which is what gives Scrum its real power for the organization. And that's, by the way, where these factor of 2, factor of 4 improvements come from. They come from not doing work that doesn't bring value. Okay, so what do? Well, on the one hand, we've got this check against market risk because every 30 days we get some validation that we're building the right thing, and every 30 days we deliver something. So if you say, can I do this? Well, if I did it once, I can do it again. Okay, so I did this, I did it in November, so I can probably do it in December. If I did it in October, I can probably do it in November. If I did it in September, I can probably do it in October. So if you've been making these tangible releases that could be shipped every month, since July, and you have to deliver for Christmas, how confident are you that you can deliver for Christmas? Okay, and from that point of view, actually quite. Okay, and if we take a closer look at Scrum, what we see is that basically everything in Scrum is somehow there to minimize one of these risks. Okay, we have the definition of done, which is guaranteeing our quality. We have the Scrum team with the Scrum Master to mitigate social risk. Okay, we have the backlog refinement and the sprint planning, which is about delivering the right scope, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, and every sprint, we produce something, which is our best, best protection of against running late. Okay, so basically, your Agile framework is designed to minimize risk and to minimize the risks of product development. Okay, and we see some really dramatic examples. Okay, Bosch was able to go from idea to sellable product in 5 weeks. Bosch makes the part distance controls for your cars, those things you put it in reverse and it goes beep, 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 beep when you're getting too close to something. They thought, well, would this be useful for a train, for a locomotive? Because you move locomotives around the train yards and, you bump into the car. It's very difficult to see where the locomotive ends and the next car begins. And there might be stuff on the track that the engineer just can't see. So first thing they did is they made a prototype based on their car device, automotive device, hung it on a locomotive, spent some time in the train yard. Did it help? Yes, it worked. Yes, it helped. Oh, and they actually prevented an accident in the first week of use. And so they decided that this was a good thing. They iterated on the design, every week a new prototype. By the 5th prototype or the 4th prototype, they had something that was ready to sell. So imagine that, from first prototype to shipping product in 5 weeks. Now notice we changed the sprint length here from a month down to a week. Okay, and that's actually a pattern in Scrum for hardware, is to get very, very short cycles around your hardware development. SpaceX building the Starship. This is their answer to the Saturn V for the Space Launch System. They're capable of building a new rocket once a month. Saturn V class rocket, they can roll out a new test one every month, and they can roll out an upgraded design every 3 months. Okay, so we're not quite at the new Saturn V once a week, but we're much better. Their competition is about once every 3 years. So we could do cite more examples from Bosch. There's actually some evidence of system there. Okay, and so this is, what I've just mentioned is what we call extreme manufacturing. And they take this idea of potentially shippable one step further. Something you can sell, something you can test in real life, or something you can use every week. Okay, so they have with their 1 week sprints. And this is really about minimizing the risk. Okay, so what I would like to do is maybe clear out some wishful thinking. A lot of what we're hearing about these digitalization projects, that they're or also any kind of product that's a hardware software combination. These are software projects. These are complex. Okay, in a situation like this, if you're not using an agile approach, you're not going to get there. So when you say we're buying from a Scrum team, we're buying from an agile team, what are we really getting? Okay, so what you're getting is that development team. You're getting a Scrum Master, and you're getting an approach to scope and risk management. And you should be getting, or if you are the Agile team, you should be producing a version of the product that you can test in the marketplace or sell, or that the client can use every sprint. Okay, we call this a potentially shippable product, but think of it in a more tangible fashion, something you can use, something you can sell, or something you can test in real life every sprint. Okay. What they need from their client, they need a product owner who's empowered to make decisions, and they need active stakeholders who will come to the sprint reviews. Why? Because they need constructive feedback at each sprint. So how does this map into the contract? Okay, we got a couple of different contract forms. So let's look at what people have been trying to do with contracts, okay? There are lots of variations on fixed scope, okay? Fixed price, fixed scope, bonus penalty clauses, time and materials with a cost ceiling. This was my introduction to contracting. I did this for a project for the Swiss government. And I've come to the conclusion that that's a heads I win, tails you lose kind of project. Because if you, I don't know if you can see this down here, but you've got your revenue, which rises linearly up to the cost ceiling. You've got your profit, which rises linearly up to the cost ceiling. And then you hit this magic point where the customer says, no, I'm not satisfied, but they're not giving you any new money. Okay, now my experience with this contract form is it ends when the supplier tells the client, dear client, I don't care if I never see you again, but we have to stop work now. So this is very difficult. And one of the things is, about these contract forms is what's the behavior that they encourage. Okay. Now, bonus penalty clauses, they actually work pretty well for things like runways. Okay, where there's a clear financial interest for getting that runway. If you're resurfacing the runway and you get that runway back in service a couple days earlier, that's good because you can start having airplanes land on it. It relieves your capacity bottlenecks and you start collecting landing fees, et cetera. If it's late, it costs you money. So it's pretty clear that everybody has an interest. A variation on this is the fixed profit contract, which is a kinder, gentler version of fixed price, fixed scope. The idea is you've got this fixed scope to deliver. You have a hourly rate which gives you profit up to a point, and then which covers your costs after that point if it goes over budget. Now, the challenge with all of these is they assume you know what you want, or at least that you can know what you want before you start. And the problem is you don't know that. So basically these things usually don't end very well. Okay. Now, if our collaboration is based on variable scope, we haven't defined in advance, then the agreement can be agile. I won't say that it is agile, okay, but it can be agile. So what does this look like? Well, time and materials, let's put it this way, it's not too bad, it could be worse. But on the other hand, when you're doing agile, you're introducing sprints, okay? And that gives you some additional checkpoints in here, which I'll come back to in a second. One of the things you can do is you can put in a cost ceiling and say, okay, here's the business objective, here's the scope that we think we're gonna get. We're not gonna fix the scope, but we're not gonna spend more money than X. So for instance, you fund your team for 3 or 4 months, you hit your cost ceiling, and then your stakeholders get to evaluate, do they want to continue funding the project or not? Whether 3 months is the right duration is something we could talk about. But this leads to a model which I call phase development, where you basically release the money in, intervals of 3 to 6 months worth of work, and then at these intervals, you kind of reevaluate the situation. And in fact, a lot of startups work on this basis. The venture capitalists, they provide enough funding to get to the next milestone. They have to demonstrate that they still have a future, at each milestone in order to get the next round of funding. Okay, another attempt at this is what's called money for nothing, changes for free. Here, the idea is we make explicit that the scope can be changed by replacing it with something, something that you haven't started, you can replace with something that you believe is more valuable. Okay, so the idea here is, you get through a point where the features that you're adding don't have much impact, so let's go do something else that has much more impact. Now, this contract got a lot of attention when it was first publicized, late 2000s, early 2010s, but I haven't seen much evidence that it's been used much in real life. If for no other reason, getting money approved is so difficult that I think people are able to just find better things to do with their money than pay a penalty for early termination. Now, what I'd like to do is suggest some ways to better align how your contract is working with what's happening. So what is a sprint? Well, for me, a sprint is something like a building block. It's always the same length, you always have the same team, and that has the side effect that it always costs the same amount. Okay, so think of it as something like a brick with a uniform dimension. Okay, now when we say, how do we want to work with these, how do we want to work with our supplier? One way to do it is to say, well, what we're really doing is buying these bricks. We're buying sprints from the team. Okay, now why do I think about it this way? Well, one thing about that team is they have unique knowledge. They have unique knowledge about each other. They have unique knowledge about the technology, about the tools to build the technology, about the marketplace, about how to work with the client, et cetera. That knowledge is actually increasingly valuable over time. So what you can do is say, okay, we are going to buy what the vendor is really selling. What the vendor is really selling is that team with the Scrum Master and the risk management framework. Now, it turns out that the cost of that team, is really just dependent on the number of sprints. And so you say, okay, we're going to buy 8 sprints, and then that might be 4 months. And then after 4 months, we're going to reevaluate. Do we want to buy another 4 months, or do we want to spend the 4 months on something else? Okay, so what you're doing here is buying what the supplier is delivering. Okay, now the other option is to say, what does the client really need? In the case of NASA, they said, what we really need is a service which will take cargo up to the space station. We don't care so much about the rocket per se, but we want the transport. Okay, so here what you're doing is you are selling what the customer really wants. To give you another example, imagine you are an energy producer. Okay, so you might be producing hydrogen, or you might be producing natural gas, or you might be producing petroleum, whatever. You could build a plant, and charge the customer to build the plant and transfer control of the plant to the customer. Okay, but what the customer really needs is the oil. So maybe you say, well, we can build that plant cheaper and we can operate it more effectively, and we can have we'll have an advantage and we'll have a profit margin. So maybe it's more in our interest to sell them the oil or the hydrogen or whatever, rather than to sell them the plant. Okay, the advantage of the service approach is that generates revenue over a long period of time. Whereas the plant, when you finish building the plant, you finish getting revenue from them unless you can find another plant to build. So what I'd like to do is give you a couple of tips for the road that might be helpful moving forward. As a client, the first thing I would encourage you to do is make sure that your contract, your agreement, aligns with the risk management of your framework. If you're doing Scrum, that means you need a product owner. The product owner almost surely has to be provided by the client, because the product owner needs decision-making authority. And every sprint needs to produce something you can use, something you can sell, or something you can test in real life. Okay. One thing which is not really defined in Scrum, which I would encourage you to do, is to identify, I call this the Chief Impediments Removal Officer. Okay, so if the client has provided the product owner, if there are issues which are slowing down the team, or why the collaboration isn't working very well, the Scrum Master, who should work for the supplier, needs to have someone to talk to who cares about the problem and has authority to get something done, and is not, how shall I say, not beholden to the product owner, who's kind of more focused on their side. I have seen customers or companies, by the way, who say, oh, well, we're going to supply the Scrum Master and we're going to supply the product owner because we want to keep control of the situation. And that's exactly the wrong attitude. That means they failed, because when the supplier has issues that need fixing on the client side, no one on the client side is going to care about that, or at least that's the pattern that I've seen. Now, again, here, if you're working in a complex environment, fixed scope projects are not in your interest. Think in terms of business goals, think in terms of budgets, ask yourself the question, how much is the solution worth? How much are we willing to pay to get that solution implemented? Okay, and that's the basis for your negotiations. Now that feels really weird. It requires more trust, and that's something that you're going to need to build up. That's what I think the alignment trust stuff in personal agility is really good for, so that you can create this trusting relationship and actually work together collaboratively from the beginning. Now, if you're on the supplier side in an agile relationship, okay, your first goal, what you need to be able to do, is deliver something that works every sprint. It's less important whether you exactly match your forecast on how many features you're going to get every sprint, but it's important that you deliver something every sprint and everything you deliver works. Okay, this, by the way, is the basis of trust. Okay, if I promise you something and I get to the end of the sprint and I haven't delivered anything, why are you going to trust me? Okay, and if I do that repeatedly, you're going to say, hey, this guy's not that reliable. Are we working with the right guy? Whereas if I deliver you something that works every sprint, and sometimes I deliver a little bit more than I thought, and sometimes I deliver a little less than I thought, but on the average, I'm reasonably predictable. Well, but what I deliver works, then I'm someone who's very easy to work with. And it's also easier to overlook when something doesn't quite go right, okay? The supplier, in my humble opinion, provides the development team and the Scrum Master. And I would go to the point and say they supply, except for the product owner, they supply the whole team. That is, it's very, very difficult when you've got multiple suppliers, providing individual bodies, especially on a part-time basis. As soon as people are part-time on the project, your performance just tanks because you've got by definition built-in dependencies. So you want your development team to be 100% dedicated to the project. If someone's 80%, because one day a week they're going to school or they have duties at home or something like that, that's okay. But you can't have people working 30% here and 40% there and 30% someplace else and expect it to work well. Okay, so if you're looking for more tips, I'd like to invite you to take a look at my book. It is available on my website. I've created a coupon code for today's event, which will take you down. Oh, wait a minute, this is the wrong one. This one will work too. We had another one, which is the, in the name of the event. Somehow I knew I was going to get this wrong, and I proofread it twice, and I still didn't get it right. You can use Careertalk as the discount code, and you'll get 20% off. Okay. And with that, I would like to say thank you very much. I'm going to stop the share and pass the talking stick back to Sunand and see if we have any questions.
Okay. The first question is, what is business agility according to you? From Deepak.
What is business agility according to me? For me, the first thing I think about, I'm trying to say, what does it mean to be agile? Let's talk about cadence. Having a rhythm where you do things, okay? This having a rhythm makes it easier to do things. It's about ownership. It's about giving things to small teams that own the whole problem. It's about speed, okay? It's about the ability to create and deliver new value to the customer quickly. It's about tangible results. And it's about alignment and leadership, okay? So the idea is through cadence, through ownership, through tangible results, we get the ability to learn and react quickly, okay? And so for me, this is what you're looking for. And I actually think one of the problems of the Agile movement as a whole is it's kind of, it doesn't, very often I don't hear much of a business focus on what we're trying to do. I hear about all the changes that we have to make, but very seldom a why, which is convincing to the executive leaders of the company, okay? So, if we talk about speed, being able, think of Bosch that was able to go with that part distance control from idea to something they could sell in 5 weeks. Another division of Bosch, they went from an idea to an automated COVID tester in 7 weeks. Okay, if you look at 3M, they went from an inquiry from Elon Musk to being able to produce solar panels that could be mounted on on your roof and not look like a highly reflective solar panel, but look like normal roofs. They were able to do that in, I believe, 7 weeks. How many of your companies can deliver anything at all in 7 weeks? That's speed. Okay, this is what, to me, and this is, by the way, this is not about cracking the whip. Okay, some places, especially you look at a place like Tesla or SpaceX, people do work very hard, but they're not fast because they are cracking the whip. They're fast because they're developing the capability to be fast. Okay, so that for me is what business agility is about. It's about being able to produce better results faster, being able to react quickly to new information.
Okay, great.
Does that answer the question? Yeah, might be interesting to hear from the person who asked the question if you got a good answer.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I heard everything about what you said. Very nice.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, Peter, the next question is basically from me.
Yes.
So we discuss about TNM with fixed scope and TNM with variable scope and cost ceiling, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what we have seen in a couple of, in the beginning, right, when you talk about Rocket and all, what I can derive from that is basically you are talking about delivery-based, outcome-based kind of model where, and if I have to correlate with my Scrum team, so if let's say my sprint goal is achieved, right, then I will get paid. And then you talk about
no. Sorry, you got to pay. You got to pay for that team. End of message. Okay. Because the thing is, if you say, well, you guys came up 2%, 10% short, so I'm going to cut your pay by 10%. Sorry, where is the trust in that? Okay. Basically what you're telling is you're telling everybody, I'm going to keep you on such a tight rope that everybody has an incentive to jump ship as soon as possible and find a safer harbor. Okay, so that's the kind of destructive thinking which makes it really this is what gives it agility a bad name is when people work this way. So if you look at your team now, I don't know how many hours a week you theoretically work. Maybe it's 40, maybe it's 38, maybe it's 42. If you guys are in India, it's probably 72 from what I've been here. Now, whether you actually get to write that down on the bill or not, I don't know. But you got a certain number of hours per week. Okay, which you consider to be sustainable. Let's use 40 because it's easy to calculate with. Then we say, okay, we got 6 people in the team. Okay, so that means we've got 6 people times 40 is 240 hours per week. For 2 weeks, that's 480. Let's round it up to 500 just to make it easy to talk about. Okay, so we know that our team costs $500 hours for a sprint, and we know that it costs, I don't know, let's say $100 for the sprint. Okay, so 500 times 100, we're up to $5,000, $50,000 for a week. Okay, and again, I have no idea what the actual numbers are. They could be higher or lower. That's now a fixed cost. Okay, now what is your team doing? What does your team commit to do? They commit to do their best to solve the problem formulated by the product owner. That's their commitment. Okay, sometimes they're going to succeed better than others, and sometimes they're not going to deliver anything, but the learning experience is so good that they don't care. Now, notice if succeed means we got an extra feature done out of the backlog, you take 10 items in the backlog, and sometimes you get 10 of them done, sometimes you get 8 or 9 of them done. Every once in a while, you get 11 or 12 done. Oh, wait, we pulled something in the backlog that we hadn't planned on. Okay, now the important thing here is that you've got something that you can ship, that is potentially shippable and works every sprint. Okay, quality is more important than quantity in every context I've ever seen. Okay, if you deliver me garbage, that means we're going to spend a lot of time arguing about bugs. If you don't deliver me anything at all, I'm not going to believe in you. Okay, so as an agile team, much more important, even if you're only delivering 1 backlog item per sprint at the beginning, but you deliver something and it works, that's good because your product owner can work with that. Okay, and then maybe as you get better, you'll be delivering 6, 8, 10, 12 backlog items per sprint. But it's that predictability that you can trust me. That's the most important thing that you need to do. My humble opinion.
Okay, so Peter, but out of these 10 contracts, right, which one you feel is more aligned toward agile way of working? So which one you feel like you have seen in your experience, like we should follow?
Okay, so let's put it this way. I think if you are a client, what I think is most in your interest is what I call fixed price sprints. You buy a certain amount of sprints for a fixed price, and that's, that makes people on the purchasing side happy because they hear fixed price. Okay, and you buy a certain number of sprints and it costs you a certain amount, and you know how much it's going to cost, and it's not going to go over budget. Okay, now you still have to have a good collaboration with the customer, to make sure that you're really delivering stuff that's bringing value. And I find in many organizations this is very challenging because they don't have much clarity of purpose. Because they don't know what they're trying to achieve, they don't know what's valuable. And so you kind of get stuck in a circle here. And so they just ask for features that some stakeholder asks for without really qualifying them, whether they're valuable or not. So that's kind of a challenge. But the idea is to get in this predictable rhythm. Now, the problem when you are a supplier, particularly when you're supplying to big companies, what big companies love to do is squeeze the lemon. Okay, so they don't want to pay a dime more than they have to for your services. So, every 6 months, what are they going to do? They're going to put out a new RFP and say, who's going to be 10% cheaper? And who will take, another, who will be happy if we get paid in 90 days instead of 60 days, games like that. So what are they doing? They're trying to make your life difficult. Or they don't care about you. They care about their own profitability. They're not even evil. They're just, focused on their own thing. Now, if you are selling a service, that puts you in a very different situation, because you can now price that service based on things that don't depend on the inputs. Okay, and I think that there's a real difference in the world. You have some companies or service companies, they generally have very narrow margins, and then you have product companies that think more in terms of investing, and they think more in terms of the return on investment. And I believe that the latter companies are more profitable. So if I were a service company, I would be trying to get out of the let's get paid by the hour mode and figure out how can I get paid for the service. Okay, because I think that that's economically in your interest.
Okay. And I have one more, query, Peter.
Yes, that sounds like it. Man, this answer does not compute. How could I possibly? But
yeah, we also have this fast function point-based delivery model, where we are not rely on any specific T&M kind of thing, but more on a delivery kind of thing. That okay, we deliver these many FPP at the certain time within a certain sprint, then we can get paid for that. So is it also covered in any, like we can correlate anything with this?
I actually consider that one of the more dysfunctional models, because what you've just done is you've given your team an incentive to inflate their estimates.
Yeah, in a way, yes, correct. Yeah,
okay,
correct.
true.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is why it's so dysfunctional, because on the one hand, if it ever goes down, people are going to get paid less, and they're going to say, well, okay, who's going to pay my light bill this month? Who's going to pay food? Who's going to pay this, or whatever, and depending on what the levels are, they're kind of at the level that threatens your existence. Okay, and again, if you push it too hard, people jump ship. They look for places that they're having a big discussion in the US right now. It would be easier to hire people if you would pay them more. Okay, and Boeing took a lot of criticism on the 737 MAX because they were paying, they paid developers in India what are probably reasonable hourly rates in India, except that they are a fraction of what those rates would be in the US. So they actually kind of looked like they were skimping terribly on safety, by hiring the low cost. So it could actually be better to be higher cost, because then you get perceived as higher quality.
Okay.
So it's really tricky.
Yeah, the only thing is, Peter, like this model has been suggested unfortunately by one big four, that's Deloitte. They suggested this in one particular project. And
does anybody hear from Deloitte? Because I'm about to say things that might get me into trouble.
Go ahead and say
it.
Okay. So that was the guy from Deloitte saying, okay, I got to take some notes here. So here is the problem. There are a lot of people thinking about the solution. Okay.
Yeah.
And management as an institution hasn't really changed. Okay. Now, all of the big consultancies, they have people who get it and they have people who don't get it. Okay. That particular model is one that probably causes most Agile coaches to simply roll their eyes, because it's so dysfunctional. It is so one-sidedly on the interest of the customer, of the client, and so totally not in the interest of the supplier. But what's even more important, this is something I talk a lot about in personal agility, the rules of the game. when you do something like that, what does it encourage people to do? Okay, so we got this brilliant consultant who came up with this brilliant idea, and all the highly paid managers are following the brilliant consultant, except it's encouraging people to game the system. Okay, it's encouraging people to produce less and give higher estimates, and it's creating this attitude of, well, we can't trust each other, so we're not going to collaborate, we're not going to speak to each other honestly about what's really going on. And if there's an area that requires truth, it's product development. Okay, because if you apply large amounts of wishful thinking, sooner or later the difference between wish and reality are going to become apparent. Okay, so that Deloitte says this is a great idea, that's wonderful. I happen to think it's highly dysfunctional. And I'm sure Deloitte is trembling in their boots because of that, but this is yeah, I do believe the truth wins out eventually, although eventually it could be at a time period that's no longer relevant for my lifetime, but I do believe the truth will come out eventually.
Okay. I have two more questions, Peter. If you have time, if you allowed, can we take that?
Okay, I think we need to have a hard stop a quarter after.
Okay.
Like our quarter till if you're in India. Yes.
Okay. Okay. So next question is from Rehman, and he's asking like, how to coach leaders on personal agility to focus on value over bureaucracy?
Oh, value over bureaucracy. That's an interesting question. I'm going to tell you my approach. The leaders are only going to talk to you about a problem when they have something which is painful for them, that they realize that they are not able to solve themselves. Okay, for me, one of the jobs of a leader is to solve problems, and as long as they think they can solve the problem, they're unlikely to ask for help. What I have found where people are most likely to ask for help, or at least the reasons they come to me, is about the social risk problem. Okay, the leaders are fighting with each other and they're frustrated and they can't stop fighting and they're not making any progress, and it's gotten so painful that they can't move forward on it. So what I usually do, for me, what we're trying to do is create alignment. We're trying to create agreement about the way to move forward. And what's surprising is that even when people are fighting intensely, if we get a chance to step back and talk to them about what really matters and what the issues are and what the challenges are and what the problems are that we need to fix, they're often surprisingly in agreement. Okay, you've heard of the Pareto Rule, the 80-20 principle, or even the 90-10 principle. My experience doing this is 90% of the time, or most of the time, people are in agreement about 80 to 90% of the issues. They've just kind of lost sight of that because they disagree violently about the remaining 10%. And a lot of that disagreement is based on differing understandings of what really matters. What do they really care about? What are they trying to optimize for? But it's not transparent what they're optimizing for. So they don't do that, they've got a lot of arguments and they don't quite understand why they have these arguments, but the arguments are based on different assumptions. So, what I do and what I have found, in fact, I just got hired as Chief Agility Officer for a startup here in Zurich today. This is my first official day on the job. What I would do is I would go in, and we have a tool in personal agility called the Stakeholder Canvas. And the idea is you go through, you do individual interviews with all of your stakeholders and ask them about the problem. Okay, the first question is about the stakeholder. Who are you? What are you doing? What's your interest in this project? What is our most important goal? Okay, what are you trying to achieve? What's making this difficult? Okay, and now we get to the sensitive, that's kind of at the technical level. Okay, we're building a rocket to the moon. The problem is getting the intercoolers to keep the engines from overheating. Okay, now we get to the trickier problems. What are you afraid of? What are you worried about? What keeps you up at night? What could go wrong? The risks, okay? The frustrations, okay? So what I try to do is I talk to the leaders on a one-on-one basis, on a confidential basis. And sometimes you might actually have to be an outsider in order to do this. And so what you want to do is understand the challenges, fears, and frustrations, understand the goal, understand the definition of awesome. And then you come back and say, okay, this is what really matters. If I've understood you correctly, this is what really matters. Okay, and so what you do is you do this for each of the stakeholders concerned. And what you'll discover is that what really matters overlaps at about, as I say, 4 out of 5 points will overlap, but maybe you'll identify a new one, which is important. Now, the amazing thing here is if you listen to the stakeholders, really listen to the whole answer, and then when they're done, say, is there anything else? And then when they're done with that, you read it back to them and say, have I understood you correctly? They're like, wow, no one ever does this. I've actually had guys say, our leadership has almost been in tears because no one actually listens to them. They're always debating with each other. So what you do is you go through and you really listen to them, okay? And you get this agreement, okay? And so what you're doing is you're starting to create alignment between you and one other person. And what you can do is you can align with all of your stakeholders that are relevant for the problem. And once you've got that alignment, then you can bring them back together and talk to them about, what do we need to be doing? Okay. Now, remember what I said about, if you listen to them, they'll listen to you. Well, this is usually the point where you can start to talk to them about agility. Okay. But you got to talk to them in their language. So like you notice, I didn't use the language of Scrum to describe business agility. I talked about cadence. I talked about ownership. I talked about speed, tangible results, alignment, leadership. These are things that your leaders will, can understand and relate to. And they'll say, cadence is important because, hey, we need to, make decisions about what brings value. And then we can say, well, this is how Scrum does it. Okay. So I think, so to kind of come back to the question, how do we get, leaders interested in what's going on? First of all, really listen to them. Second, use language that they understand. Okay, and a lot of the agile language is just kind of blah 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 blah. It's like you talk to your doctor. Your doctor has a language completely their own. No normal people understand it. They understand it, but you don't. Okay, so if your doctor wants you to do something, they got to talk in your language. Well, if you want your managers to do something, you got to talk in their language. So really listen to them. Okay, step number one, create that trust. Then help them recognize where they have commonalities. And in this workshop, this is where you can start to introduce the agile ideas and they can see how it's going to help them. And the thing that I've seen is once people get it, this is why I think one of the use cases, I think there are two use cases for personal agility. One is creating alignment, and the other is that bridge for your leadership into the rest of business agility. Kind of once they see what it does for them, then they'll be on board with it and you won't have to convince them anymore. Okay, and I'm right now, the reason I'm Chief Agility Officer for this company is hey, this is logical, this stuff makes sense. Why weren't we doing this before? Now it's easy.
Great. Rahman, you got your answer. I think it's in so detailed picture. You have explained each and
It's
everything.
absolute. Yes, it's absolute gold. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. And this is where I'd encourage you to take a look at personal agility and maybe take a look at one of our workshops, because this is a teachable skill, how to create alignment. Okay, and you go through the personal agility program and you learn to be trustworthy and you learn to achieve long-term goals, and you learn how this alignment, how to create alignment, how to create how to be a catalyst in your organization, how to be a leader in your organization. Okay, now for the first half, those first two goals, alignment, long-term goals, there I have high confidence you'll be able to do it when you leave. With the other one, you'll kind of know how it works, but you'll probably need more practice before you can really do it. But you have your license to learn, just to start doing it. So just to set the expectation right. Okay. Yes.
Okay, I have a last query from Guru.
Yes.
Guru, can you ask this question? So can we say more of a subscription-based model?
I'm sorry, what is the question?
Guru, you are there? Can you explain? I think he's asking like, I think when you are describing this, right? He's asking that looks like this is more on a subscription-based model kind of thing where you just subscribe. When you mention about that, anyone can come and purchase the sprint, right? Something like that. I think that's in that sense.
Okay, so the subscription-based model, what's an example of a subscription-based model? Okay, Office 365. Okay, you don't buy the software, you pay them a fee every year and they update it more or less continuously. Okay. I use a service called Freshbooks for my bookkeeping. I use one called, what's the other one? Well, they used to call it Receipt Bank, but they gave it a new name. I think it's called Dex now. Which I use to scan receipts and export the data into my bookkeeping system. Okay, so each of these things, they cost me a fee every month in order to use them. Okay, that's software as a service. So now let's say you've got an RFP and they say, we want to see your bid. Well, one way to do it is to say, okay, we're going to develop the software and we're going to have this much on manpower and this much on software and this much on hardware costs and blah, 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 add it all up and this is what it costs. Okay. The other thing that that you could do is say, okay, well, we're going to give you a, we're going to give you we're not going to charge you to develop the software, but we're going to charge you $100 per user and month in order to use it. Now, you say, well, wait a minute, how does that work? But isn't that going to be a lot of effort? Well, here's the thing. If you look at the RFP process, especially if it's being done classically, that process is usually so expensive, you can probably develop, kind of a version 1 of the software for less effort than it takes to answer the RFP. At least that's been my experience doing Swiss government RFPs. I don't do Swiss government RFPs anymore because they're so expensive to answer and the chances of winning are so low, it's just not worth the effort. So, that's kind of how you would, do it is you would say, well, here's the requirement. Okay, we'll offer it to you for X. Okay, and that's kind of what NASA did with SpaceX. They said, okay, we're basically going to, fund your development costs, okay, up to a certain point. So, here are some criteria that you have to satisfy. When you meet this criteria, how much do you want for it? When you meet that criteria, how much do you want for it? Okay. No effort calculations involved from the point of view of NASA. They just said, okay, here are the tests. Can you do it? If you do, how much do you want for that? Okay, and it added up to, I don't know, a couple $2 billion for each contractor. But when the test passed, they paid the money and everybody was happy. Now NASA is afterwards paying for the flights, and that was also part of their quote. Okay, so every time that the SpaceX or Boeing launches launches for NASA up to the space station, they're going to pay a certain amount for the launch. Okay, and that's kind of how it works. So Does that answer the question?
Yes, Peter, thanks. Yes, Peter, thanks.
Okay. Peter, if you have a time, we have one last one from Gayatri.
Okay, I got 2 minutes that I got to do a hard stop because I have another call in an hour and I have to catch my breath, or 45 minutes now, so I have to catch my breath afterwards before I do the next one.
Okay. So the last question is from Gayatri. When we are doing Agile, is the culture of learning and celebrating failure encouraged? It's a question mark. What is the take of stakeholders on this? Do they support this culture and mindset shift? Basically, I think it's talk about failure when we discuss about Agile, fail fast. So is this kind of thing has been how the other stakeholder or the people sitting at the top management, they look toward this fail fast?
Okay. Yeah, well, again, look at the example of NASA and the Space Launch System. They said, no, we're not allowed to fail. So $20 billion later, they hadn't failed, but they hadn't done much testing either. So, or they hadn't done much flying. Okay. I don't like the term, celebrating failure. Okay. Failure is just failure. The question is, what do we get from it? Okay. What we're trying to do, I don't want to fail. I want to succeed. But if I do fail, I want to fail cheaply. I want to fail quickly so I can learn. Okay. So fail fast is a synonym for learn quickly. So what you need to be doing, and in fact, I've seen a number of startups in this situation where, they push their product out there, they think it's wonderful, but the customers don't use it. Okay, market risk. Now, what do? I say, oh, we've got the wrong customers. Let's try it with a different set of customers, and then they have the same problem. Oh, well, these customers weren't the right ones easier. Let's go over here. Okay, and after a while, you run out of money. Okay, and then your startup dies. Okay, so what you need to be able to do is learn quickly, especially if you're doing anything entrepreneurial. If you're trying to create a new product, you need to learn quickly what your customers or users really want. Okay, so, and if you do fail, you need to have enough money left over that you can try again, and enough time left over so you can try again. So like, I'm working with a startup, and we have the issue of activation, and the activations are, where the customers actually start using it, and that's not going very well. And before I got involved, well, this has been an issue for months and we hadn't done anything about it. Well, now we're going to try to get that cadence going where we say, how are we doing every week? Make it visible, learn quickly. Okay, so maybe substitute fail fast and celebrate failure with learn quickly and celebrate learning. Okay, and I think you'll be happier. I think you'll be happier with that.
Gayatri?
Yes, so thanks, Phil. It was really a great explanation. I completely agree with you, and a very nice example shared by you. So yes, I got my answer.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Okay.
So I'm going to say,
yeah, I think then that's all for today. Yeah, thanks guys. And yeah, thanks one more time, Peter, for your time. I really appreciate the way you have taken through all these contracts, and I'm definitely, like other people, will definitely learn out of it. So thanks again, Peter.
okay, I believe I put my, if you go into the chat, you'll find that I put an offer into the chat. If you'd like to get my book on 10 contracts, you can go to 10contracts.org, and then you can use Careerstalk as the discount code, and it will give you a 20% discount. If you go to my website, saat-network.ch/pass, you'll find out about the Personal Agility program, or you can go to, this is a little bit harder to spell, Personal Agility institute.org. I hope I typed that right. If I didn't, run spell check on it.
Okay.
And this is where you can find out more about personal agility. And one last link, if you would like to connect with me on LinkedIn, I'd be very happy to connect. And you'll find the link here, which again, I hope I've typed correctly.
Yep.
And so with that, I want to say thank you very much. It has been a pleasure. Thank you, Sunan, for the invitation. Thank you all for coming, and look forward to seeing you again sometime.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Have a nice weekend.
Thanks
Bye.
everyone. Thanks, Peter. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Sunan.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone.